Hello, and welcome to our talk with Duncan Weldon on his book Blood and Treasure: The Economics of Conflict from the Vikings to Ukraine. I'm Karthik Shankaran, Senior Research Fellow Geoeconomics in the Global South Program of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. The Quincy Institute is a transpartisan think tank based in Washington, D.C., that advocates a foreign policy that emphasizes military restraint and diplomatic engagement and cooperation with other nations. We believe that such an approach will serve American interests and values better than policies that prioritize the maintenance of U.S. global dominance through force. Now, in the Global South program, we study and write about a vast arc of countries going from the Philippines through Southeast Asia, South Asia, Africa, and Latin America, Manila to Mexico City, as it were. These are countries that are not great powers and are not primary allies of a great power in geopolitical terms. In economic terms, these are countries whose primary focus right now is development. And within the Global South program at QI, I focus on geoeconomics, the interaction of economics with geopolitics. And of course, that intersection makes this book an absolute natural to talk about. It has already been released in the UK to great acclaim and will be released in the US on January 6th, if I'm not mistaken. Duncan Weldon is a British economist, journalist, and author. He regularly writes for the Financial Times, New Statesman, and other publications on economic topics. He was previously the economics correspondent at Newsnight, the BBC's flagship nightly current affairs program, the Britain economics correspondent at The Economist, and an associate editor at Prospect, a current affairs magazine. He began his career at the Bank of England and has also worked in asset management and public policy before switching to journalism. He's also the author of 200 Years of Muddling Through, An Economic History of Britain Since the Industrial Revolution, and that's a great read as well. I recommend it strongly. He has written and presented a series of radio documentaries on economic and economic history topics and is a regular television and radio commentator on macroeconomics. Duncan's also a long-distance friend. As I would phrase it. He's someone I first met virtually more than 10 years ago in that precinct of social media called Finance Twitter, where complete strangers argue furiously and form deep alliances and animosities based on their views about the global financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis and modern monetary theory, Brexit, and a million other things. He's a great guy, a good friend, and he's also been quite tolerant of my fondness for terrible puns. I'm very, very glad to have him here. Uh, Welcome, Duncan, and thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Um, Now, when you first told me about the book and the title, I will admit you actually broke the news of the book to me when I said something rude about blood and treasure being a phrase that editors should retire. And then you said, well, that's the title of my new book. And then I went, oh, Duncan's writing a new book. I love the first one, so we need to have him on. But when you first told me about the book and title, my first thoughts went to Power and Plenty, which is by Finlay and O'Rourke, which is kind of the industry standard in a sense of the last 1,000 years of economic history, the interaction of geopolitics and economics. This covers a lot of the same territory, but in a very different, very engaging, very approachable way. I mean, for instance, there's this wonderful examination of the incentive structures behind Caribbean piracy, how that worked, for instance. So I just want to start. Could you tell our listeners about the organization of the book and why you chose the episodes you did and why you chose the questions that you did?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And to start off with Power and Plenty. Power and Plenty is an absolutely magnificent book. It's the first book cited when I talk about, suggested further reading after this book. It's a book I've loved for a long time. You say it's the industry standard. It absolutely is. If you want a global economic history of integration and fragmentation, which takes politics and power seriously over the last millennium, it is the book to read. Blood and Treasure, I think, is many of the themes are in common, but as you say, it's a very different book. For a start, Power and Plenty is something like 1,000 pages.
It's a dwarf number,
It's
yes.
a tremendous, tremendous book. But you could beat a man to death with it, with a physical copy. It's harder to do that with Blood and Treasure. Blood and Treasure, I was trying to write for, as well as people who, in this field, I was trying to write for that elusive, general, interested reader. So it's a much shorter book, and I think a much easier one to drop into and drop out of. I think when I organized it though, the organization is very much episodic and thematic. I think there are about 18 substantive chapters, each of which is looking at a different aspect of warfare or conflict, sometimes quite broadly defined, over the last roughly 1,000 years, and trying to draw out some of the economics behind it, either as a different way of looking at a familiar story, or at least a different angle looking at a perhaps familiar story. And it's sort of a mix of economics and history. My publisher tells me I cannot refer to it as horrible history, but with numbers. Horrible History being a very popular series of books in the UK aimed at children, which focus on sort of, bloody aspects of history. Although it is a little bit horrible history, but with numbers at some point. But yeah, so it's not it's obviously not a narrative lasting 1,000 years. It's some episodic bits which I think draw out wider lessons with quite a focus towards the end on sort of big turning points in the economic history of war in the 19th and 20th century. And finally, long-winded answer, but this is the question I'm used to answering. What is this book? Sort of sitting behind it are sort of two core themes, I think. One is, all of which will be very familiar to economists, social scientists. One is the use of incentives and understanding incentive structures to understand behavior. And secondly, and I think more importantly in some ways, understanding institutions and how institutional setups shape warfare. And sort of the core theme of the book, really, I keep coming back to, is how warfare changed the development of the state, of institutional design, and how those changes in the state changed warfare, and this sort of evolving interlinkage between the two.
Thanks. No, I mean, this, I think one of the things that we have both had a deep interest in and kind of interacted on social media is this Charles Tilley idea, right? War makes the state and the state makes war. And that's very much what uh, so I think, there's Power and Plenty and then there's Tilley are the two things that I thought of while I was reading your book, but also Pirates of the Caribbean and a great many other things, which is a lot of fun. And there's a lot in the book, but again, kind of in comparison with with kind of standard economic histories, there's also a fair even of geoeconomic histories. There are some things that are not, and the two big exceptions it seemed to me were one is, I mean, obviously it's only the last 1,000 years, so there's not much about the initial uh, expansion of Islam and the Arab world. But that does seem to be so essentially I think of it as the economics and the geoeconomics of the Muslim world is something that's really not present at all, whether it's the Southern Mediterranean and Iberia, whether it's the Near East, and also kind of the Indian Ocean basin, those interactions between southern India and Southeast Asia that are I think of a big part of economic history. Someone has there's there have been some efforts, I think, and some interesting ones at being a Braudel of the Indian Ocean, a title that's kind of still up for grabs. But it's a big part of the economic history of the world that's not there. I mean, it was that a conscious choice? I mean, I assume it was. So yeah, just talk a little about that.
Yeah, so I mean, there's there's quite a lot missing, as well as there been quite a lot there, and the way these projects work, that there were in the initial draft, there were three chapters which basically had to go because I was well over the target word count, and one of those chapters which had to go was on was basically another chapter on the Second World War. Just there was too much Second World War that had to go. One was my chapter on Napoleon, and this one I argued very strongly about with my publisher and editor. And they kept saying, fundamentally, Duncan, I think you're just really interested in Napoleon and you want Napoleon in, even if you don't have a huge amount to say about Napoleon. Eventually, I admitted this may be true. But the one which I really regret going wasn't on sort of the Indian Ocean, which I think would have been a very good topic. But I did have a chapter which is now on the cutting room floor on sort of the Ottoman Empire, which
Hmm.
would have brought in some of this, which I think is a fun. It was trying to it was trying to answer the question of how do we have the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century, which is fundamentally the superpower in Western Eurasia. Um, it's sort of steamrolling its way across North Africa, into the Balkans, and you fast forward 2 or 3 centuries, and then we've got the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe, as it was called. How did this happen? And I think some really interesting economics around there, some really interesting dependency, some really interesting institutional history. I think, the thesis which I was sort of outlining in that chapter, which didn't make the final cut, and I will probably at some point dust off for somewhere else, is the Ottoman Empire was almost too successful as an early modern state. It had, one of the most effective tax raising systems of any great power. It's absolutely flush with cash. When you compare it to the Habsburgs, it's fighting. You're always borrowing money. The Ottomans are not borrowing. Partially for cultural and religious reasons, partially just because they have no need to, because they have all of this cash. They can afford to put much larger armies in the field
Hmm.
than their European rivals and pay for them. But as a result, you don't get that financial revolution. You don't get that development of debt markets,
Hmm.
which goes on to be a real source of strength for other powers, and they eventually fall away. But yes, sadly, that didn't make the final cut.
Well, I mean, on the on the Second World War, I mean, I'll note that because of my childhood in India, I grew up with Commando comics, which is something that people. And it's actually not a genre that exists in America. The historical war comic targeted at targeted young boys, but that was kind of an extremely formative part of my life. So I did get a very British read of the Second World War as a result of exposure to those. There was
Yes.
a lot of El Alamein in Burma and kind of Italy D-Day. But anyway, that's another story. Now returning to, I mean, your very first chapter is on the Vikings, and it's really fascinating because one of the things you mention is um, kind of how promotion in Viking society depended on being a good kind of violence specialist, I think is the term that you use. And there's also some very interesting developments in Viking predation over time. Um, so could you talk a little bit about that and yeah, and explain Danegeld to us?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, there are lots of interesting points in the economics of the Vikings. It's not just a case of, hairy men arriving in a boat, robbing a monastery and, getting back in their boat. That would be fundamentally not very interesting economically. It's zero sum or negative sum stuff. What I find fascinating about the Vikings, 2 points that I think are interesting about the Vikings. One is this point you just mentioned about how sort of methods of Viking operation around Europe change. So at the start of the Viking Age, the Vikings are raiders. They're arriving by boat, either on coasts or coming down rivers. They're raiding, they're stealing stuff, they're putting movable wealth back on their boats, and they're heading away. You get a big change starting in the 9th century. You start to see in parts of what's now France, parts of what's now the United Kingdom, large Viking armies arriving and not going away, overwintering, um, staying put. Um, and what you start to see when you look at the economics of this, I go back to sort of the Manker Olson work in the 1960s about the difference between roving and stationary bandits. Now,
Hmm.
the ideal type of bandit to be robbed by is no bandit. Your first best solution is there is no banditry involved. But if you are going to be robbed by a bandit, it is much better to be robbed by a stationary bandit than a roving bandit because their incentives are very different. The roving bandit, your Viking arriving off the coast of Lindisfarne in northern England to rob the monastery in a ship, your roving bandit. They're incentivized to kill as many people as they need to, do as much damage as they need to, use as much violence as they need to, grab as much as they can carry, and make their exit. Your stationary bandit, though, you're one that's operating more like a protection racket that's charging,
Hmm.
extortion, that's using menaces to get money, who tends to stay around in the area for a long time. Their incentives look very different. They don't want to kill the goose, which is laying them golden eggs. And actually, they start eventually do provide some protection, to provide some form of public goods, to start to look actually like quite successful um, state builders. Now, I mean, the other point worth touching on with the Vikings is about the Danegeld. The Danegeld, this idea that when there is a large Viking army demanding money with menaces, that rather than fighting them off, sometimes you should just pay them a tribute, pay them a payment. This is something that lots of Frankish kings did. It's something lots of Anglo-Saxon kings did. And this has sort of gained a bad reputation. There's a whole Kipling poem on why paying the Danegeld is a bad idea, and they're not going to you'll if you give in to the bullies and give in to their menaces and pay them money, they will just keep coming back and demanding more money. I mean, what I find interesting is we've got this period in northwestern Europe in particular, often referred to as the Viking Age, roughly 800 to 1000 AD. And we know there were an awful lot of Viking raids and then Viking armies and tribute payments and all of this. But as far as we can tell, it doesn't have a negative impact on the European economy. That's, in fact, if anything, trade and exchange around the North Sea and around areas exposed to the Vikings increase. And it's fundamentally, when you think about the economics of paying tribute to the Vikings, I mean, in raw macroeconomic terms, as we'd think about it in the 20th century, we're talking about a financial transfer. And after a financial transfer, we would then generally expect transfer of sort of real goods. When the Vikings who had settled in, say, Normandy, land of the Northmen, now Normandy in France, originally Vikings sort of claimed the Duchy of Normandy. If they are taking tribute payments from other nearby regions of what's now France, they're then going to use that money to buy goods and services, lots of it from the people around them who have
Hmm.
paid this tribute. And you get this weird thing when you're in a sort of pre-modern economy which is not operating at capacity because there's no profit maximization. If taxes can actually spur more production because people aren't producing as much as they theoretically could. If their tax bill is put up, they just produce more. So you get this weird situation when, you know, Danegeld payments, the Vikings may have stimulated more trade, production, and exchange than a counterfactual in which they weren't there.
So this is a point where the Vikings are present. They are not the state, but they are an extractive force that the state needs to tend to. And so but the Vikings, if they stick around, they're also spending their booty in the neighborhood, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
That's really fascinating. We do have all everyone who's listening, we have a question. You can ask questions. Just put them in the chat box. Um, I may not take them up right away, but I will certainly take them up. Not all of them, but please do ask questions. Um, and it's interesting because there's also I I've seen some work on the mafia, for instance, which is by Diego Gambetta, which is quite interesting, which suggests that one of the in the mafia case, they're also kind of specialists in violence. They also claim to provide protection of a certain kind, but in order to maximize their revenues, they provide protection selectively, not to everybody.
Yeah,
And that's one of the differences between once you're a full-on stationary bandit and you
yeah,
have a mechanism of taxation that targets everybody, it's in your interests to deliver the public goods to everybody.
yeah.
Whereas if you are kind of a competitor to a weak state, then it makes sense to provide it selectively because you want to get people to sign up rather than generally, and you don't have a generalized mechanism to target everybody. That's really,
Absolutely.
and I mean, but there is a group because the second chapter is about a group that actually makes that transition from being a group of um, kind of roving bandits, as it were, a nomadic tribe, to being not quite stationary
Yeah,
because
yeah.
they remain mobile, but are state creators on an extraordinary scale, and that's Genghis Khan and the Mongols. And in what you describe Genghis Khan as having invented globalization, and my reaction to the Jack Weatherford book that years ago was, "Oh my God, Genghis Khan was the first neoliberal." So I think both of us um, have had this kind of similar reaction to Mongol Mongol history. So how how did the empire work? And what were the consequences of that empire, more importantly?
Yes, I mean, very briefly, if you get the Eurasian steppe in your head, this great expanse of land stretching from sort of Hungary in Eastern Europe all of the way to China, from sort of the borders of the Middle East and modern day Iran all the way up to Russia. It's this large expanse which is not really suited to sedentary, productive agriculture. So, the population patterns across Eurasia for a long time have looked like they are today. If large population centers in India, China, Europe, a much less densely populated steppe, and a sort of the kind of place where, in the absence of sedentary agriculture and settled populations, you get nomadic, nomadic people moving with the grass with their herds. And Genghis Khan's great genius is to build an empire um, based around a nomadic rather than a settled society. But it's not like a later European empire. The model to have in your head is not people turning up, planting a flag, appointing colonial administrators, and claiming territory and setting down laws. It's much of the empire looks more like a tribute taking empire. There's always been interactions between settled people and people on the steppe, nomadic people, sometimes take the form of trade, sometimes of raiding. This turns it into a tributary system. But for the purposes of globalization, what makes it really interesting is for around 150 years, you have this political unification of much of Eurasia. You have the Mongol Empire providing the public goods of order, of relatively safe travel routes along, the Silk Roads, of connecting trade between all of these different parts of Eurasia. You see all sorts of knowledge transfers. You see Chinese herbal and medicine techniques being introduced into what's then Persia. You see Persian surgical techniques being introduced into um, China. You get, I think, the first really significantly important episode of what we'd now call globalization. Now, we've got to be careful. The volume of trade is much lower than in later globalization episodes. And the kind of stuff that's moving is stuff with a very high ratio of value to weight. We are talking, um, spices and silks and porcelain. We're not talking, manufactured goods of a larger sense, but we do get this exchange of ideas. We get a limited movement of people. We get um, trade, and I think you get very different experiences of this in Europe and in China, which I think have very long-lasting impacts as well on how trade openness is perceived in those societies.
And there's also, um, could you, we have a couple of questions here about Napoleon. So you'll be, you probably saw, so you'll get to talk about you. I promise you will get to talk to Napoleon in response to both Stephen Shore and Keith Ruffin, who both asked about this. And Elizabeth Block congratulates you on pronouncing Genghis correctly. I mispronounced it, so I apologize, but I will do better from now on. Now that I know. Um, so the could you just a little bit more about the differences between China and Europe on the Mongol experience? Because that's something you do mention, and it is really interesting and important.
Well, I think Europe is never part of the Mongol Empire. There are Mongol incursions as far into into bits of Eastern Europe, but it's not lasting. So Europe never really gets the downside of Mongol
Yeah,
rule. 'Cause, it's very easy to talk up
yeah.
provision of public goods and economic openness and trade and exchange, but this came at a cost in terms of human lives, in terms of tribute payments paid over. Europe doesn't really get the downsides of Mongol rule, and Europe is also one of the great beneficiaries from all of this transfer of knowledge because Europe is fundamentally, a more scientific backwards compared to
Mhm,
many other parts of the world at this time. So, benefits from these Chinese and Persian and Indian ideas. But more importantly, people that are prepared to make the journey, particularly people like Italian merchants who make this journey across, on boats to Crimea and then down the Silk Road and then back. They make great fortunes. And the lesson they learn, builds up capital, which is important for later European growth. It raises the status of merchants within European society, and it fundamentally plants the idea in many of these people's heads that there is money to be made through trade with the outside world, which I think is important when we get into what's sometimes called the age of discovery, etc.
mhm,
Um, whereas China bears the brunt of the costs of conquest. Millions of Chinese people are killed. They have years of being subjected to Mongol rule. They benefit far less from this transfer of knowledge because China is quite far ahead in many of these areas already. So, they're
mhm,
not getting much back, and Chinese ideas and innovations and inventions are being used elsewhere. And I think for many years, many generations afterwards, there isn't this sense that the outside world is this source of, great riches through trade. There is this sense that the outside world, came and subjected us, and we were big losers from this, and let's not let that happen again.
mhm, mhm. That makes sense. I mean, and part of you know, you think when you mentioned the steps, and yeah, I think what you're seeing is scale, right? So, and of course, and you mentioned the age of discovery because that is yet another example of scale is really immense, and that's the European discovery and conquest of the Americas. And one of the reasons we chose the picture for the invite that we did is precisely because it captures those elements of blood and treasure because there's obviously a lot of treasure and there's an, a, a lot of blood. I mean, an extraordinary amount of blood, in fact. And Spain is the key here. Spain is the superpower. Um, And yet, your description of the economics of the conquest really is almost the Spanish experience is the what not to wear of geoeconomics for the next few centuries. And Spain does success for the Northern European powers in many respects means not doing what Spain did. So what was the Spanish experience
Yeah.
or the
So
interaction of conquest with the Spanish state?
yeah, I mean, what I find fascinating about this is, if you look at Europe in about 1500 AD, the richest parts of Europe, as far as we can tell, in terms of income per head, in terms of wealth levels, are roughly where they were 1,000 years before. It's the bits around the Mediterranean. It's southern Spain. It's bits of Spain, bits of Italy, bits of southern France, but particularly Spain and Italy. And lots of this is united under Habsburg rule from Charles V and his son Philip II. They rule the richest bits of Europe. They rule, and then they are handed, they conquer much of the Americas as well. And yet, as we say, in the following centuries, what you have is Spanish decline as a great power, and also Spain losing this economic place within Europe, with the center of European economic gravity moving from the Mediterranean to the North Sea, to England and the Dutch Republic, and later Great Britain, the United Kingdom. I think a lot of this, many reasons are going to in the book, but I think the most important one to keep in mind here is sort of the institutional structure. I think it's sort of a common theme, I think, sort of this early modern period onwards, that supposedly absolute monarchs, whether that be the Spanish Habsburgs or later sort of Ancien regime France, actually are often much less powerful than small L liberal states like the Dutch Republic or England and then Great Britain, the United Kingdom. So fundamentally, governing is even as a king a bargaining um, process. And it's about binding in elites, whether they be old aristocratic elites or whether they be rising merchant and capitalist elites into your state. Once those people think they have buy-in, once they think they have some power, once there is some form of even limited legislative system, when they think they've got skin in the game for how the rules are drawn up, you can extract more in the way of tax revenue. You can give the state more power. These people are prepared to see the state have more power because they are reasonably certain they can prevent this power being turned onto them. The conquest of the Americas by the Habsburgs, I think, short circuits a lot of this institutional development in Spain because it gives the Habsburg kings of Spain this source of revenue from the Americas, which means they feel less need to rely on domestic revenue raising. You see the number of parliaments being summoned in the Habsburg realms declining, even whilst it's rising in the Dutch Republic and in England. Kings try to become more absolutist, and they've got this revenue stream because they've got this external revenue stream. They don't feel the need to engage with domestic elites in the same way. They generally spend it on failed bids for European mastery and increasingly rely on borrowing more and more to fund ever expensive wars. This is the time of a revolution in military affairs, warfare becoming more expensive. And what you get is a Spain which is no longer the wealthiest part of Europe, no longer the most economically dynamic part, and is in fact overburdened. And a great deal of resources have, been siphoned away to trying to exploit the Americas rather than develop the Spanish economy.
And I mean, in that context, does it, what's the impact of, there's obviously an impact within Spain of this, but you also have these, there's kind of a class of Spanish grandees that becomes entrenched in the new world as well. I mean, do they have any access to those resources? Does
Yes, I mean they do, and again, it's this. Yes, particularly as sort of one way in which Spanish kings are happy to raise revenue is to either sell tax exemptions or sell public office. That sort of venial office we tend to think of in pre-revolutionary France becomes very common in Habsburg Spain as well. And fundamentally, if you are a Spanish noble with a bit of money to spend, throwing that into, silver mines in South America seems to offer you better returns in the short term than, agricultural development in Spain.
and as you point out, I mean, you have a very different, almost the opposite set of things happening in Northern Europe. In and in areas that are in fact that contest Spain because this coincides with the Protestant Revolution, and so there's a religious element here as well. And you talk about how you get a kind of institutional development politically, uh, both socially and politically, because you have different classes, you have a mercantile class, you have parliaments, but there's also a very interesting set of financial developments that goes alongside that. And so just the next step here probably is to think about what are the financial developments, financial innovations that you
Yeah,
see
so
in
I
the
think,
North, like the Bank of England, for instance.
yeah, completely. And I think this is one of the big shifts, I think, between sort of the medieval world and the pre-medieval world and the early modern world onwards. We are in a governments borrowing to pay for war and governments running of debts in the era of Philip II is generally a sign of an unsuccessful state. That it's having, it can't raise tax revenues. It's having to resort to borrowing. As these states become more indebted, they become militarily weaker. You go to the 18th century, and you've got the ability to borrow on good terms is suddenly a huge source of strength. It becomes a force multiplier in international affairs. And that's because of a series of innovations at first in the Dutch Republic, and then from the 1690s onwards, imported into England, which becomes Great Britain. Yes, it's things like separating separating the finances of the monarch or the royal house from the state, of setting up proper parliamentary control of expenditure, of establishing a central bank to manage government debt, of establishing, what we now recognize as a proper national debt, which is going to be there for the long run, which you're going to build up credibility by not defaulting on, by meeting the payments, by servicing the debt. So, the long run story here is over 1690s all the way up to the Napoleonic Wars, is of British government borrowing costs falling, even as the quantum of British government debt rises. This is a hugely important thing in the Napoleonic Wars, Britain's ability to pay subsidies to allies on the continent to subsidize their war costs, as well as paying for its own, doing it all through borrowed money. Interest rates as low as 2.5% at times.
And this seems like a good way to jump into the two questions that we have uh, about Napoleon from Keith Ruffin and sorry, and Stephen Shore. So, I mean, one of the questions is, could you summarize your chapter about Napoleon? But just even before that, what seems to be happening in France, and our friend, I think our our mutual friend Mike Bird wrote about this in his dissertation, if I recall correctly. Um, the what's the difference in the experience of French finance between 1790 and 1815, and British finance. You already talked about the British. You already talked about on the British side, and kind of going from there in, into the career of Napoleon itself, and what was left on the cutting room floor.
Yeah, a lot. I mean, lots. I mean, fundamentally, the difference between Britain and France is, we talk about this sort of over-indebted ancien regime, which, eventually, collapses into the revolution. Um, what is sometimes missed out here is that, the overall level of British debt is higher than French debt in the 1780s. Much of this French debt was, French debt incurred during the American War of Independence, supporting what became the United States and the 7 Years' War beforehand. This was also hugely expensive for Britain, which lost that war. Britain might have a higher volume of debt, but the interest rate is much lower. The service costs are much more manageable. So it's partially that sort of comparison. What I think is interesting during the French Revolutionary Wars and then the Napoleonic Wars is just how much larger, how much bigger warfare becomes. Once the French Republic, comes with the concept of, the nation, the levy en masse, the nation in arms. Um, yeah, armies grow almost exponentially larger over the course of this period. And there's a really big turning point in the history of war once you've got this concept of a nation under arms. You just look at Napoleon's career. If you look at Napoleon's battles in the 1790s in Italy, where he makes his reputation as a general, we are generally talking battles which last one day with maybe 20, 25,000 soldiers on each side, fought in areas which are maybe a few square miles. By the end of Napoleon's career, we are talking armies of more than 100,000 taking the field in much larger areas. Battles quite commonly taking more than a day. Just the entire nature of warfare has changed over the course of 2 decades. The French Revolution has, given birth to this idea of the nation, and then very quickly the idea of the nation in arms.
Yeah, and then that's a process that kind of diffuses outward because you have the Prussian military reforms in 1806, so everyone kind of responds to
Yes,
that.
yes,
Um, and then and here, I mean, that takes us, into the kind of the long. uh, I remember when I was teaching, one of my favorite fun facts to tell undergraduates that there's a long 19th century that lasted exactly 125 years, because on August 4th, 1789, the Assemblée Nationale abolished feudalism, and August 4th, 1914, the Social Democrats in Germany voted war credits. So it's kind of a useful teaching device
nice. Mm,
35 years ago, but just nice to
mm.
have
Yeah,
write down right down to the date. And I think this kind of brings us to, it also takes us into the age of total war. But I want to go back a little bit before we move on to that front, because for all these developments, and this seems like something inexorable, right? That you have um, you have this process of state formation and military technology and military complexity. They all grow together, but there's also all these uneven bits that are really fascinating. There is the history of piracy.
yeah,
There are you have a lovely chapter about the Renaissance and the condottieri, who kind of essentially mercenary captains who prefer not to fight
yeah,
because that's ruining their capital investment. And then um, well into the, even in this period, there's prize money for captains of the Royal Navy, which is perhaps not that far removed from piracy itself. It's the commission versus the letter of marque, but still, here,
yeah,
you keep it.
yeah.
So how does this kind of parallel structure of micro incentives. How do you think about that in the context of these big picture things that are happening to the state in warfare?
Yeah, I mean, things are messy and uneven, and this is not it's not this teleological process, of everything evolving, and developing in the same way. I mean, just going back to the early modern period up to Napoleon. You get very different patterns of state development in the Dutch Republic and in England than you do in Spain and France. You get the concept of the nation under arms starting in France. And you get this, like you say, weird sort of blurred boundaries between private and public actors across many different types of warfare. So, you briefly mentioned the sort of, letters of marque, the idea of privateers who are essentially, a privateer is essentially a pirate with a letter from one state saying it's okay to be a pirate as long as you're concentrating on our enemies. You know, Privateering was not outlawed, was not abolished until the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Crimean War in the 1850s. This continues very late. And indeed, in the Franco-Prussian War, 1870-71, the Prussians used what they called a volunteer navy, which looks very like privateering on a smaller scale. So, the pattern of development, even in Europe, where we are getting this sort of, faster state development than in other parts of the world, is uneven and has many, many rough edges throughout the period.
I mean, do you, you're a historian, but you're also a commentator on on current affairs. So, I mean, do you see any vestiges of this kind of private army stuff? It's you have Blackwater, you have North Korean crypto ransom, which I think of as a kind of as a kind of privateering. What are the parallels you think about today from from what you've written about? There's obviously there's obviously the scale, but there's also in these interstices now, there seems to be an awful lot of private and privateering reemerging.
Yeah, I mean, look, even if you step back just from, if you step back from violence for a moment, just keeping, I think it is always useful to keep the concept of economic rent and economic rent extraction and how different sectors can interact with the state when it comes to extracting and dividing up between them rents. I think there are parts of the US tech sector, which I think, what we are seeing is quite a bit of rent extract. That there is real economic dynamism and innovation in some parts of tech, and there are other parts that look like they've found a way to extract some rents, and they've done a deal with the US state to protect the rent extraction. Why that comes back, I think, to war and violence is it is absolutely fascinating to me that, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, if you spoke to officials in the European Union, they would still talk about the Brussels effect of, the European Union is not a military power, but it is this global regulatory superpower. And Europe can set rules, and because the market is so large, other countries just have to align to an extent with European rules. What we saw this year was the president of the European Commission flying to a last minute summit at a Scottish golf course when Donald Trump was there inspecting his golf courses to strike what was a very, in many ways, one-sided trade deal in which Europe accepted quite high tariffs on some major exports and agreed not to put up tariffs in return, and also, didn't use the one bit of leverage it potentially had, which was tougher regulations on American tech firms. Why did Europe do that? Europe did that partially because of the war in Ukraine. because Europe is determined to keep the United States on board as a partner, providing, American intelligence support, American weapons, financial support, etc. So what you see there is US hard military power being leveraged into sort of the economic realm to do a one-sided trade deal, so trade deal in inverted commas there, and also protecting US tech extraction of some rent from EU citizens. We are not in a world where hard military power is irrelevant.
Yeah, and I mean the other thing that, as someone who started in history and then ended up in in emerging markets finance and now doing what I do now at QI, one of the interesting issues here is that a lot of these processes you talk about um, are closely intertwined. And this goes back to tell you, war makes the state makes war. You can have this enormous expansion of state capacity that's tied up in essentially has a fundamental link to violence. And one of the things, or if not violence, at least interstate competition. And one of the things that I wrestle with, given my, you know, g- given my belief, our belief as an institution at QI, that we want to dial those kinds of pressures back. What do you, and this I think particularly matters for countries in the global south that are looking for development. How do you keep those kinds of innovations in state capacity, in finance, in technology, without having the impetus that comes from interstate competition, especially violent interstate competition? How do we
Yeah,
do that?
no, I agree. I think there's an important distinction here between historical development and where we are now. The historical developments is yes, we're national debts, central banks, systems of taxation and customs and exercise. Lots of these things, are born in interstate competition and warfare. It's fundamentally where these tools come from. But we are, I mean, one of the major turning points, I think, comes in the 19th century. I think before the 19th century, you can argue, you know, whether or not any war would be economically good, in again in inverted commas for the victor, you can make the case for in certain cases. I think after the 19th century, once you get, high explosives and all of these other things, once you get wars that start destroying capital as well as killing people, it becomes very, very hard to find any economic rationale, in terms of economic GDP gains for warfare. Wars become not only bloodier, but more costly. So, we're not in. So, in the 20th century, in the 21st century in particular, it's hard to find a war which will pay for itself. And just because many of these institutions and much of this state capacity was built in a time when states were competing with each other more, when the threat of war was more real and more pressing, doesn't mean they can only come about in those circumstances. So there are plenty of reasons why a state which lacks a credible and effective central bank should be wanting a credible and effective central bank, other than it will make financing a war easier. These are many often good innovations in themselves. And yes, the threat of interstate competition can perhaps provide that impetus to development and did in much of Europe in the 17th, 18th century. But I don't think it's the only potential driver.
Thanks. We have a question from Hope Benny. I hope I'm saying that right. Having taught world history, which included covering reasons for the fall of empires. It seemed empires fell due to imperial overreach and subsequent bankruptcy. Is this your understanding of these dynamics? And let me add on to that. I mean, you see a lot. Now, Ferguson has argued that once you start spending more on interest payments than you do on defense, um, you're it's the end basically. They're about to ring the bell on you. So just the question and the prognosis.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is some. Yeah, I think there is some truth in this. I don't mean it's the sole driver, but yes, imperial overstretch, grander geopolitical ambitions than your economy can actually support. A rising share of your economy going on military spending and debt interest. Sometimes you can lump them. Certainly before the 19th century, you can lump them together because, you know, before the 19th century, states spent money on two things. They spent money on warfare and they spent money on debt interest. And the debt interest bill generally, referred to previous wars, much of what the state did. Um, so yeah, I think as a general thesis, um, it often holds whether it holds, whether that rule about debt interest payments more than defense holds today, who knows? I mean, the British government at the moment is spending more on debt interest as of last year than it is on defense spending uh, by quite somewhere.
Um, what what do you I mean I think there's a great lesson here that all the things that made states, even if they're connected to interstate competition, there are good reasons to do them besides that. Now, I would come back to, for me, one of the reasons to have your own central bank, I would argue, and I've argued, is because you want sovereignty. And sovereignty is not just an issue of something that, obviously, if you don't want, tanks crossing your border, but also you don't want to be indebted in a currency that's not your own. So that I think of as a kind of a good, peaceful reason to do some of the things uh, that you've talked about. Uh, what do you think you're going to write about next? I mean, have you thought about it?
I have. I mean, having done two books now, what I've learned is that writing a book is a bit like having children, in that, the idea for a book is very exciting. Having written a book is wonderful. The bit in the middle is much less fun. It's sort of like why I say it's like having children is, when you have a child and you have a small baby in the house, and it is very, very, very hard. And then a few years down the road, you sort of forget about that really hard bit and think it's just nice having children. So you swear at the time, I'm never doing this again. I have three children, two books. So that probably I will forget about the actual writing the book being very, very tough and return to it. But yes, I have played around with a few ideas, and I think I would actually like to write something on sort of this shift in Europe from the Mediterranean to the North Sea and the various factors around at the time, the economics underpinning that shift in Europe's center of economic gravity, sort of in the early modern period, but not yet.
Well, thanks very much, Duncan. That was Blood and Treasure, arriving in American bookstores on January 6th, I believe. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Gr a great read, and thank you, Duncan, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. But before you go, I wanted everyone to look at our website for the Quincy Institute, where you'll find links to the various activities that are linked to our mission. I described our goals, and what we do is we do frequent book talks on a range of subjects. We do webinars, we publish notes and briefs, and we have a free online news publication called Responsible Statecraft um, that tackles a number of issues. I have something, my colleague and we have something in there today on the Development Finance Corporation we actually make the argument that now that the Development Finance Corporation is a great entity. It's good for development. We're concerned that it's being kind of over mustered into great power competition. Perhaps we should be caring about other things than critical minerals. So that's the kind of thing you'll find on our website. We have reporting from staff, non-resident fellows, contributors from around the world. So please check out all that we offer. Thank you, Duncan, and thanks to all of you for joining us.